The rain had been falling on Saint-Merou for 6 days, without pause when Corporal Edouard Vauban first heard the sound. He was kneeling beside the patrol truck on the D14, both hands slick with grease, trying to coax the rear differential back into something resembling mechanical dignity when the noise came down from the ridge. Not thunder, not aircraft, not any category his 32 years on this earth had provided language for. It was a tone more than a sound. It pressed itself into the bones, behind his ears the way a dentist's drill presses into a molar before the nerve knows to scream. He stood up slowly. The field above the road was orange with late wheat. The storm had bent the stalks flat overnight and they hadn't recovered, so the whole hillside lay like a wet dog. And against that matted copper ground, against the low iron sky, a thing floated that had no business floating. It was the size of a farmhouse. It had no wings, no exhaust, no visible means of caring about gravity. It moved the way oil moves on still water, a slow, arrogant drift, and it caught the gray afternoon light and gave back nothing, not a reflection, not a shimmer. Just an absence of return, a disc-shaped hole in the world. Vauban stood beside the broken truck with his hands at his sides and watched it for 11 seconds. He counted. He was the kind of man who counted things, who noted times, who filed the small facts of observation the way other people filed receipts, because you never knew. Because his mother had told him when he was 7 years old, and not yet a person who paid attention, that the most important word a policeman could speak was, "I noticed." Then the thing was gone, up through the cloud base, without so much as disturbing the vapor, and the tone died. And the rain kept falling, and he was alone again with the differential. He drove back to the gendarmerie, without repairing the differential, and told Sergeant Marchetti everything he had seen, precisely in the order he had seen it. Marchetti was behind his desk eating a ham sandwich. He did not pause to set down. "Bupide," he said. He always called Vauban by the wrong name. A habit that had calcified over 4 years into something like affection. "You've been working in the rain all morning." "That is correct. And you're telling me the rain showed you a spaceship." "I'm telling you, I saw something in that field, above the D14. I'm telling you it made a sound I cannot describe with language I currently own. I'm telling you it was not from here." Marchetti chewed thoughtfully. He was a big man, Marchetti, with a face that had been lived in strenuously and showed every year of it. He had been a gendarme for 22 years and had developed the particular investigative competence of a man who has stopped being surprised by what people do to each other, to themselves, to the facts. But he had also developed as a corollary a reliable skepticism about what people saw, especially when they had been out in the wet for 3 hours and hadn't slept well. "You didn't sleep last night," Marchetti said. "I slept 6 hours. You slept badly then. I slept adequately. What I saw was not a product of fatigue, Sergeant." "No, of course not. What did it look like?" "Told you what it looked like." "Tell me again." So Vauban told him again, exactly in the same order, and Marchetti ate his sandwich and listened with the expression of a man who has already decided what he thinks and is waiting out the formality of telling. When Vauban finished, Marchetti balled up his sandwich paper and said, in a way that was genuinely not unkind, "The light does things in the rain. The eye fills in shapes that aren't there. You've been working split shifts for 2 weeks, and the field above the D14 is where old Perrier used to run his greenhouse before he sold the land, and there was always something glinting up there on bad days." "It wasn't glinting," Vauban said. "It was present. Go home and sleep, Bupide." Vauban went back to the differential instead. It wasn't until the following morning, when Captain Blancard himself saw the saucer, that the conversation changed in register. Blancard was not a mystical man. He was 5'7" and intensely conscious of it. He had served in 3 postings and been passed over for promotion twice, and had developed, in compensation, the absolute institutional certainty of a man who has decided that precision and correctness are their own reward. He kept his office at a military standard of neatness. He signed his paperwork in triplicate. He did not believe in UFOs, ghosts, the French left wing, or things that could not be entered into the log without a category. But he had been driving the Ridge Road alone, at 06:30, when the field lit up. He sat across from Vauban at the morning briefing with the look of a man who has been handed a document in a language he cannot file. You saw it, Vauban said. I saw a phenomenon, Blancard said carefully, in the tone of a man selecting words the way a surgeon selects instruments. A light source of undetermined origin above the D14 at approximately 0620. There was an associated acoustic signature I would describe as subharmonic. I am looking into it. With respect, sir, I looked into it yesterday. You reported a vision, Corporal. I am looking into a documented phenomenon, the same documented phenomenon. Blancard did not respond to this because responding to it would require acknowledging that it was true, and acknowledging that it was true would require acknowledging that he had dismissed Vauban's identical account the previous day, and he was not yet prepared to do that before breakfast. The prefecture sent a notice that afternoon. Regional Commander General Lavalette would be inspecting the Sainte-Marie station within 48 hours. Everything was to be in order. Blancard spent the rest of the day polishing things that didn't need polishing and telling himself the light above the D14 was a military test, vehicle of some kind. Experimental, classified, exactly the sort of thing that wouldn't appear in any register he had access to but would absolutely have an explanation once the right phone calls were made. It was not a military test vehicle. The man walked into the gendarmerie at 1800 hours and asked for Vauban by name. His right name. The name that wasn't Beaupede. He was young, or appeared young, and he had the face of someone who had assembled it from a photograph rather than inhabited it. Too symmetric, too untroubled, the eyes set slightly too still. He wore civilian clothes that fit him with the imprecise perfection of a costume chosen for accuracy rather than effort. He sat across from Vauban in the interview room and folded his hands on the table with the patience of something that has all the time it intends to spend on this, he said, in French that was technically flawless and completely bloodless, that he was part of an expeditionary team, that they had arrived to study the human population of this region, which had been selected because its summer tourism made it a concentrated sample of the species. He said this the way you state a budget line, without apology or warmth, as information being transferred, rather than communication being offered. Vauban listened. Shh. He had a cup of coffee in front of him that had been cold for 3 hours. He looked at the man across the table and thought about what Marchetti had said. The light does things in the rain. The eye fills in shapes. Show me something, Vauban said. The thing, and he knew looking at it, that it was a thing wearing a man the way you wear an overcoat, tilted its head a fraction of a centimeter. A processing pause. Then it was Vauban. It was sitting across from him in his own face, his own hands, his own posture, the slight forward lean he had developed from years of paperwork, his own crow's feet, his own left ear, sitting millimeters lower than his right from a fracture he'd taken at 24 that had never quite resolved. It had the coffee stain on his left cuff. It had the exact callus on his right index finger from the pattern of how he held his pen. Vaughn became aware, in a peripheral dissociated way, that he had stopped breathing. The shape shifted back. The stranger again, symmetrical. Calm as an instrument. We mean no harm, it said. We observe. Vauban breathed out very slowly and very deliberately. He picked up his cold coffee and drank from it. His hands were completely steady, and he noted this with the part of his mind that was always noting things, filed it away, hands steady. Good. He set the mug down. How many of you? He said. More than you know. In Sainte-Marie specifically. The head tilt again. Enough to complete the study. And what do you intend to do after the study? Leave, it said. Simple as that, leave. The way you leave a library. And the people you've been wearing. There was a pause that was not quite human. They are unharmed. The forms are duplicated, not occupied. Vauban looked at his own hands. He was thinking about what it meant to be duplicated. About some version of him, wearing his face in his cuff stain and his lower left ear, walking the streets of Sainte-Marie, doing whatever these things did when they observed. Filing reports that he would never read about himself. I'm going to need you to stay here, he said. That will not be possible, the thing said, and stood, and was gone before Vauban had fully processed the sentence. The chair barely moved. The door hadn't opened. One moment it was there, the next the room was just him and his cold coffee. And the chair he'd knocked over when he jumped to his feet and realized, one terrible second late, that it was already gone. He went out into the main corridor and ran directly into Marchetti, who was coming in from the yard, who had the general's aide-de-camp on the phone, who was already composing the look on his face that would be required to receive a regional commander tomorrow. And behind Marchetti was Blancard, and behind Blancard was the door to the courtyard where the general's advance vehicle was, already pulling in 12 hours early because Lavalette was the kind of general who arrived before expected. Vauban stood in the corridor and said, "Alien," he said. "Shapeshifter." He said, "Interview room 10 seconds ago." He said these things into the general noise of the corridor where nothing was, still, and everyone was moving, and the interview room, when Blancard checked it, contained nothing but a knocked-over chair. Blancard sent him home in the particular voice of a man who has decided that mercy and containment are the same operation. Vauban drove home in the rain. His wife Danielle was at the kitchen table, with a glass of wine and a book she was not reading. She had the look she got when she was waiting, not worried exactly. She had been married to him for 14 years and had moved past worry into something more like careful attention, the same posture a person takes with a summer fire that is not yet a problem and might not become one. He sat across from her and told her everything, beginning to end twice, because she asked him to. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she closed her book on her thumb to hold the page, a habit he had observed her perform approximately 800 times, and which, he noticed now as if for the first time, the smallness of it, the domestic certainty. "You believe what you saw," she said. "I know what I saw. Blancard doesn't." Blancard is managing upward. Lavalette is coming tomorrow, and the safest story for Blancard right now is that his corporal needs sleep. Danielle poured him wine, a Thursday wine, nothing special, the case from the supermarket outside town, and said, "Then you have to go back. He told me to stay home." "Blancard told you to stay home. You didn't tell Lavalette anything. Lavalette hasn't heard it yet." She looked at him over her glass. "You know the difference between a problem that's been seen and a problem that hasn't been seen?" "Yes, then go see it." She drove him to the edge of the woods at the south end of town, and when he got out she looked at him through the window with something that was not quite fear and not quite pride, but lived in that neighborhood, the particular look of a person who has decided not to say what they are thinking, because the thinking is not useful to either party right now. He touched her face through the window. She put her hand over his. "Don't get stabbed," she said. "I'll do my best." "I mean it, Edouard." "Let anyone stab you." He walked into the town. Saint-Merou at midnight was itself. Cobblestones, geraniums going soft in the window boxes. The bread smell from the bakery that started at 3 a.m. A cat under the awning of the tabac. The harbor lights doubled in the wet pavement. He had walked this town for 11 years and knew it. The way you know the weight of something you've carried for a long time. Not consciously, completely. Where the drain on the Rue Carnot backed up in heavy rain. Where old Marchand left his delivery bicycle. Where the fire brigade kept its auxiliary pump in the station's side yard, accessible from the alley, if you knew which door. He saw one of them, on the esplanade. Young man in a jacket, walking with the measured pace of something that had studied walking, but had not absorbed it, fractionally too even. The arms swing in intervals that were just barely off the human rhythm. Vauban had been a gendarme for 11 years, and he knew the rhythm of a guilty walk, a drunk walk, a frightened walk. He knew the walk of someone who was late, and the walk of someone who wanted to be seen, and the walk of someone who did not want to be seen. This was none of those. This was a performance of ordinary movement, by something that had learned ordinary movement as a technique. He followed it down the esplanade, and watched it stop at the water's edge, and look out at the harbor lights. He watched it stand perfectly still in the rain, not moving its collar up, not adjusting to the cold the way a human body adjusts because it cannot help it. Just standing, indifferent to temperature, looking out at the moored boats with the fixed attention of something cataloging. It turned, and it knew him across 15 meters of wet esplanade. Threat. Recognition. It had his profile, probably. His file. It knew he'd been sent home. The face it wore was no one he recognized, a composite, maybe the average face of the town. "You should go home," it said, the French immaculate, the music wrong. "That's been said to me today already," Bond said. "I find I keep not doing it. This does not serve you. I'm inclined to disagree." It looked at him with those glass-still eyes. You are one man, it said. Your station does not believe you. Your superior has dismissed you. What do you intend to accomplish here alone? Vauban put his hands in his coat pockets. The rain was getting into his collar. You studied us, he said. Extensively. For how long? Months. This region for 11 weeks. And you understand us. We understand you better than you know. He nodded slowly. Then you understand that when a man from this town, who has been in this town for 11 years, who knows every door and every drain and every auxiliary pump, when that man decides something needs doing, there is not much you can plan around that. The thing on the esplanade processed this. He watched it process it. The face did the small movements of consideration. The eyes stayed glass. There is nothing you can do alone, it said. I'm not alone, Vauban said. I'm just the one standing in front of you. He turned and walked away at the pace of a man who is not running, because running is a piece of information he doesn't want to give. He turned onto the Rue Carnot. He walked to the alley behind the fire station. He let himself in through the side door that had a lock that Berlico had told him about 2 years ago, during a conversation about nothing in particular, and he stood in the dark fire station, smelling rubber and metal and the particular stored emergency smell of an institution that exists, for moments and waits between them. He made 3 phone calls. Marchetti picked up on the second ring, which meant he hadn't been asleep. He didn't explain. He said, I need you and Taupin and Berlico at the harbor esplanade. 20 minutes. Don't ask me questions until you get here. Silence. Vauban, Marchetti said. Bopide, Vauban said. You can call me Bopide, just come. Another silence, shorter. 20 minutes, Marchetti said. He told them at the esplanade in the rain, standing with the harbor behind him and the town at his back. He told them about the interview room, the shape change, the walk, the conversation at the water's edge. He told them about the metallic resonance, the sound when you struck one, like a knuckle on a boiler. And while they stood there, he asked them to be quiet and listen to the water, and to remember that sound, the dense, unhuman note of something with mass but no softness. Marchetti listened with his arms folded and his face unreadable, which was the face he wore when he was deciding something. Taupin had produced a croissant from somewhere on his person, as he always did in moments of tension, and was eating it in the methodical way of a man who has learned that the body's needs do not pause for circumstances. Berlica, who was skeptical the way scaffolding is skeptical, structurally, inherently, not as a choice but as a condition, stood with his jaw set and said, when Vauban finished, You want us to believe there are aliens in Saint-Maru. I want you to be at the Café Tumes at 7:30 tomorrow morning, and watch what the tourist in the blue windbreaker orders for breakfast. Why? Because he drinks motor oil. A pause. That is a medical condition, Taupin said through his croissant. It is not a medical condition. Read about it. There was a thing on the radio, Taupin. I'm just saying 7:30. Vauban said. Café du Commerce. Watch what he orders. After they left, he stood alone for a while at the water's edge and did what he did when he was working through a problem, which was to stop trying to work through it and instead just look at what was in front of him. The harbor, 30-odd moored boats, the cafe with its lights off, the fire station 2 streets back with its auxiliary pump in the side yard, the Rue Carnot, which reached from the harbor to the south end of town. The fire brigade's truck, which could be at the Rue Carnot position in under 3 minutes if someone drove it from the station yard. He knew where the water was. He spent 2 hours in the fire station's break room with the back of a tourist map of the Var region and a borrowed pen, drawing positions. Plan exactly. A map of what he had and where and how much pressure. He was not a tactician. He was a man who knew his town and had paid attention to the things in it for a long time. He marked 3 positions with circles. He wrote the pressure figure from the station's maintenance board next to each one. He wrote 60mm hose beside each circle, and then he wrote reach, 40 meters, and then he folded the map and put it in his pocket and turned off the light. Tourist in the blue windbreaker was at the Café du Commerce at 0730, ordering from the menu with flat, technically correct French. There were 2 of them today at the corner table, both in blue windbreakers, which was not remarkable. Tourists wore blue windbreakers the way September wore rain. They had ordered coffee, which sat untouched in front of them. They had been brought croissants, which they had stacked neatly to one side. They were looking at the room with the flat, cataloging attention of something counting inventory. And then one of them reached inside its jacket and produced a small flask and poured something brown and viscous into a glass and drank it. Motor oil. Berlico looked at Vauban. Vauban looked back. Berlico's jaw was still set. "All right," he said, very quietly. Then Taupin reached across the table for the bread basket and knocked over his water glass. The water spread across the white tablecloth and caught the nearer tourist on the wrist and hand. A small domestic accident, the kind that happens 30 times a day in every cafe in France. The tourist looked at its hand. Then it stood very quickly and made a sound. Not a word, not a scream. A frequency, a grinding metallic protest, like a gear turning against a stripped thread. The sound of something being asked to perform an operation at its tolerance limit. The surface of its hand had gone wrong. The water was working into the seams of the human shape, finding the gaps between the copy and the original. Through those seams came something that was metal, and not flesh, and not any category of living thing Vauban had a word for. The second tourist grabbed the first, and they were out the door before the waiter had turned around. Vauban was already moving. He had the walkie-talkie out before he hit the street. He pressed the call button twice, the signal, which he had explained to Marchetti the previous night, and heard, from the direction of the harbor, the growing sound of the fire brigade's auxiliary pump starting up. He had spent 3 hours the previous night arranging it. He had not slept. He had driven the brigade's secondary hose truck himself. Marchetti had the engine keys. Taupin drove. Berlico managed the pump. To the 3 positions he had circled on the tourist map. He had positioned them himself with his own feet, walking the distances, checking lines of sight around corners, looking at where the streets funneled toward the field above the D14, the way he would look at a river when he was thinking about floods. It was not a military operation. There was nothing in the manual for it. He had done it with a pen and a borrowed map, and 11 years of knowing where the streets went. The chase, if you could call it that, and the report would call it that because no better word was available, lasted 22 minutes. The aliens, hit with water and known, abandoned their human shapes the way a fire abandons a thing it has consumed, rapidly and without elegance. The shapes fell away, and what was underneath was metal and light and the bone-pressing tone. 7 of them converged on the field above the D14 from 3 directions, moving fast, moving with the fluid certainty of something that has finally decided to stop performing and simply function. Chetty had got to 3 of the other gendarmes at the station, men who had heard the pump and understood, without being told, that some had changed, that the thing they'd been circling for 2 days had arrived. They came with the hoses and the truck and approximately 400 liters of Saint-Maru municipal water, and they pursued 7 alien machines through streets that were still waking up, past the bakery that smelled of bread, past old Marsican's bicycle, past the cat under the tabac awning, who watched all of it with complete feline ignorance. There was a moment on the esplanade when one of them turned. It turned and faced Vauban with a face it had assembled from pieces of his, and it's something in a frequency that was not French and not any human language, and he understood it anyway. The way you understand a piece of music the first time you hear it, the meaning arriving before the translation, bypassing language entirely and landing somewhere older. It said, why? Not a threat, not a tactical question. A genuine inquiry from something that had been studying humanity for 11 weeks and had filed volumes of data, and had, he understood this suddenly and completely, not found an answer to this particular question in any of it. Why do you fight for this? He was running. He didn't answer. But he thought, running with the hose over his shoulder, and the rain still coming down, and the bakery smell behind him, because I know where the water is. Because I have been here for 11 years and I know every door and every drain and every street, and this is not information to me. This is not data. This is the weight of the thing I have been carrying for 11 years. And it is mine, and you cannot copy that. You can copy my face. You can copy the coffee stain on my cuff, and the callus on my finger, and the exact placement of my crow's feet. You can wear me better than I wear myself in certain lights, but you did not walk these streets. You did not stay up 3 hours with a tourist map and a pen, working out pressure and coverage, because something needed doing, and no one else was going to do it. You cannot simulate 11 years of paying attention. They hit the field above the D-14 with the last of the water. 4 of the 7 went down. The others made the saucer, which had descended silently to the field, while the engagement was happening, while they, all distracted. With the chase, the ship had come down to receive them. And then several things happened simultaneously, in the way that things happen in the middle of a real event, rather than a planned one. Blancard, who had followed the noise from the station without his uniform jacket on, stumbled into the field, and then into the saucer's open hatch, because the hatch was at ground level, and he was moving quickly and not watching where he was going. Taupin, who had followed Blancard because Taupin always followed whoever was in front of him in a crisis, went in after him. 2 others after that, Gaston and Berlico, pulled in by the same current of proximity and urgency and the particular human tendency to go where the action is without stopping to ask whether you've been invited. The saucer sealed. It rose. It was exactly as he remembered from the first morning, arrogant, indifferent to gravity, moving like oil on water. It caught the gray light and returned nothing. It climbed 20 meters, 30, and Vauban stood in the field with the empty hose in his hands and watched and thought, "That's Blancard in there. That's Taupin with his croissant." Then it paused. It hung in the air for 7 seconds, he counted, and then instead of going up through the cloud base, it moved in a slow arc back, toward the harbor, descending. Moving with the unhurried quality of something that had lost power, that was no longer choosing its trajectory but simply following it. It found the harbor the way a thrown stone finds water, with weight and inevitability. It went in with a sound that was felt more than heard, a deep displacement that sent waves across every moored boat simultaneously, and broke across the esplanade and washed against the steps of the Café du Commerce, and knocked over 2 chairs outside the tabac. The harbor swallowed it. For one moment there was no other sound, just rain on water, just the harbor breathing. Then the surface broke and 7 men came up, gasping and alive, and confused in the way that people are confused when they have survived something. They did not plan to survive and cannot yet reconstruct. One of them was Blancard, whose uniform jacket was gone, whose remaining clothing was plastered to him in the way clothing plasters to a man who has just piloted an alien spacecraft into a harbor, accidentally. One was Taupin, who had somehow retained half a croissant. One was Berlico, coughing seawater and swearing in a dialect specific to his village. They had boarded the ship, and the ship had run out of power, and the aliens who had been retreating had come back for it and found it occupied by wet, frightened, absolutely unreasonable French gendarmes who had no idea what they were doing and had therefore done something no tactical model could have predicted. They had sat in the control room and touched things. Vauban would learn this later. They had touched things. They had argued about which things to touch. Taupin had eaten his croissant. Blancard had found something that looked like a display and stared at it for a very long time, with the expression of a man trying to read a document in a language he has studied for approximately 3 minutes. Berlico had found what turned out to be the emergency flotation protocol and had engaged it while trying to engage the door release, which was why the saucer had descended toward the harbor rather than rising, and why it had gone in rather than landing, and why they were now all in the water. None of this was planned. All of it worked. General Lavalette stood at the harbor's edge in his full-dress uniform, wet from the knees down, because a wave from the saucer's descent had reached the esplanade, and he looked at the 7 men coming out of the water, and then he looked at Vauban. "You," he said, "sir, you organized this. I made some phone calls, sir. I also drew on a map. You took fire brigade equipment without authorization. You deployed municipal water resources without authorization. You engaged in a pursuit through residential areas without authorization." "Yes, sir." "And you did all of this because you saw a light above the D-14, and then talked to something in an interview room, and followed one on the esplanade, sir, and confirmed the water vulnerability at the Café du Commerce." The general looked at the 4 inert metallic forms lying in the wet field, which were very clearly and unmistakably not of this earth and at the 7 wet gendarmes being helped out of the harbor, and at the crowd of confused townspeople, and at the alien spacecraft visible just below the harbor surface, its outline catching the morning light in the way that nothing made of earthly material catches light. "Why water?" the general said. "They're metal at their core, sir. Under the shapes, water rusts them. I heard it when one was struck in the interview room, and when one was splashed at the cafe, the sound. And then I thought about what causes that in metal and water is the obvious answer." "The obvious answer," Lavalette repeated. "To someone paying attention, sir. Yes." The general looked at him for a long moment. The expression on his face was the expression of a man reassessing a category. Vauban knew that expression. He had produced it before, in men who had decided what he was before listening to what he said. "I'm going to need a written report," the general said. "Yes, sir. Everything. The beginning. Yes, sir." "And Vauban, sir, the next time you see something above the D14, you inform me directly. Not through Blancard. Not through channels. Me." "Yes, sir." Lavalette walked away toward the harbor. Vauban stood alone at the field's edge for a moment in the rain that had not stopped. And then Marchetti appeared beside him with 2 paper cups of coffee, which was not something Marchetti had done in Vauban's memory, and which seemed, now given everything, like the only possible next step. "That was interesting," Marchetti said. "Yes," Vauban said. "The water. You were certain." "I was not certain. I was working with what I had." 60%? 70? Vauban thought about this. About the tourist map on the break room table. At 2 in the morning. With the circles and the pressure figures. About whether what he had been doing in that room constitutes certainty or just a decision made in the absence of better options. "Enough percent," he said. Marchetti handed him the coffee. It was too hot and too sweet, which were attributes that became, in that specific moment, exactly right. Vauban drank it and looked at the field, and thought about 11 seconds, counted, at the side of the road in the rain. He thought about the thing on the esplanade, asking why. He didn't have an answer that translated. He had the coffee and the rain and the bakery smell from the Rue Carnot, and the harbor behind him, settling back into itself after the extraordinary violence of the morning, boats rocking on the displaced water, the surface smoothing over the shape underneath the way, water always smoothed over, what it had been asked to hold. He had 11 years. He had the specific knowledge of a specific town possessed by a specific man who had paid attention to it for a long time. You cannot copy that. You can study it. You can wear its face. You can file reports on it for 11 weeks, from above the D14, and come away with every empirical fact it contains. And you will still not have, because it is not a fact. It is the residue of time spent. It is the calluses on the finger from how the pen is held. It is knowing which bakery door doesn't lock and where the fire brigade keeps its auxiliary. It is knowing, when the moment comes, where the water is. He went home. Danielle was at the kitchen table, actually reading now, the book open and engaged. She read when she had decided that whatever was going to happen had happened, and her part in waiting was done. She looked up at him. He was wet from the shoulders down and smelled of harbor water and the sulfur metal note the alien machines left on the air, a smell he would later learn was unique to their oxidization process and that no amount of ordinary detergent would fully address. She looked at him. "Well," she said, "we got them." She nodded, the way she nodded when she had known the outcome before he said it and was only waiting for the word. She made coffee, real coffee, not paper cups, the thick kind he liked in the small ceramic cups from the market in Aix, and he sat down across from, and she poured without asking. "How many got away?" she said. 3 in the ship. Will they come back?" He thought about this, about what it would mean to come back, about whether 7 weeks of study in a French coastal town had given them enough information about humanity to understand what they would be returning to. "I don't know," he said, "maybe. But if they do, they know what I know about water." Danielle considered this. "That's not reassuring, no. But it means they know we figured it out, which means they know we pay attention." He drank the coffee. It was hot. That might be worth more than the water. She looked at him over her cup, with the look that meant she was deciding whether this was wisdom or rationalization, was a look she gave him regularly, and which he had long since accepted as a form of love. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. Her hand was warm. His was cold from the rain and the harbor. He turned his palm up and held hers. They sat like that while the coffee steamed and the rain continued its sixth day on Saint Maru, unhurried, indifferent, thoroughly itself. He would write the report. It would be 63 pages and would require 3 revisions before Lavalette signed off on it. And it would be classified at a level that meant almost no one who mattered would read it for 25 years. When his daughter read it, she would call him and say, "Papa, I didn't know." And he would say, "There wasn't much to know. I saw something above the D14. I paid attention. I knew where the water was." But that was later. Now there was the kitchen and the coffee and the rain and his wife's hand over his, and outside on the Rue Carnot, a town going back to work. The bakery smell arriving on schedule, old Marchand's bicycle out, tabac. Cat reassumed its position under the awning as if nothing had happened above it, because for the cat, nothing had. In the field above the D14, the wheat lay flat and wet, and copper in the gray morning light. In the harbor, the shape of the saucer was still visible just below the surface, catching the light in the way that only impossible things catch light. Men from the prefecture would arrive in the afternoon, with instruments and questions. More men would come after that. The questions would multiply faster than they could be answered. And the answers that were given would raise more questions. And the whole bureaucratic apparatus would expand around the event the way water expands around a stone dropped into it. None of that had started yet. The sound came once more, briefly, from somewhere above the cloud base. The tone that pressed into the bone behind the ear. The tone that was not thunder, not aircraft, not any category the world had had language for until 3 days ago. It held for perhaps 4 seconds, and then it was gone, up and away, through weather that did not notice it leaving. Saint Maru was a town again. Just that. Town in the Var with rain on its cobblestones, and a bakery at 3 a.m., and a harbor with an interesting new secret and a gendarme who knew where the water was, sitting in his kitchen, face hand over his, drinking coffee that was, against all reasonable expectation, given the week, exactly right. He was the kind of man who paid attention. That, in the end, was all it had taken. He filed the report in the small hours of the following morning, sitting at the kitchen table and Danielle asleep down the hall, and the last of coffee going cold beside his pen. He wrote it the way he did everything, attention first, chronology second, meaning third. He wrote what he saw, above the D14 on the first morning, the 11 seconds of it, the tone. He wrote what the thing in the interview room said and did not say. He wrote the Esplanade conversation in full, because he thought the question it had asked him, why, was the most important sinks of data in the entire document, and he wanted it on record. He wrote, an entity with demonstrated capacity for human physical mimicry, capable of language acquisition, and apparently extensive prior observation of this community, asked why we resist. It is my opinion that this question is not rhetorical. It reflects a genuine gap in their model of human behavior. They can copy what we look like and what we say. They cannot predict what we will do when the thing we know is threatened. He underlined that last sentence. Then he thought about it and crossed out the underline, because underlining things in a report looked like you were shouting, and he didn't need to shout. The sentence stood on its own. Lavalette called him at Z0800 the next morning. Not on the station line, on his home phone. He said, the prefecture has been informed, he said. There will be people here by end of week, he said. Keep your mouth shut in the meantime. Which was a thing. Generals said when they meant the opposite of keep your mouth shut. When they meant the work you did is now someone else's problem, and we are grateful to you for generating it. Yes, sir. Blancard apologized on the third day, in the particular way of a man who has decided that an apology will cost less than the alternative. He came to Vauban's desk and said, you were right. He said it to the middle distance rather than to Vauban's face, which was how Blancard apologized, the words traveling sideways rather than directly. Vauban said, thank you, sir. He did not say anything else. He had 11 years of experience with what happened when you added to an apology that was already costing the other person. Marchetti never apologized. This was also fine. Marchetti expressed remorse by calling him Vauban instead of Beaupede for about a week afterward, which was more meaningful than anything a formal apology could have done. Taupin told the story at every possible opportunity for the rest of his career, and each time he told it, the croissant in the story became larger and more central to the successful outcome of the operation. By the final version, told at his retirement dinner 12 years later, the croissant had been instrumental in the navigation of the alien craft. Vauban was present at that dinner and said nothing. Some things were better preserved in amber. The metallic remains of the 4 downed entities were moved to a facility outside Paris within the week and were not seen again by anyone in St. Maru. The saucer was removed from the harbor over 3 nights in late September by a team from somewhere that did not put its name on vehicles. The harbor went back to being a harbor. The tourist season wound down and the windbreakers were put away and the cafe tables came in and the geraniums in the window boxes gave up their summer campaign and went brown. In November, a man from a government office Vauban had never heard of drove out from Paris and sat in the interview room. The same interview room, which Vauban noted was still slightly dusty, under the chair where he had knocked it over, and asked him to describe the water vulnerability in technical terms. Vauban said it rusts them. The man said, "Can you be more specific?" Vauban said, "I am being specific. They are metal under the shapes. Water accelerates oxidization at a rate incompatible with continued function." The man wrote things on a notepad. He said, "How did you determine this?" Vauban said, "I heard the sound it made when I hit the one in the interview room on the back, trying to help it cough. I heard the sound the one at the cafe made when the water hit its hand, the 2 sounds together, and asked myself, what makes a thing sound like that, and what can be done about it?" The man put his pen down and looked at Vauban over the notepad. He said, "You worked this out from the sound?" Vauban said, "I was paying attention." The man nodded and wrote something else. He closed his notepad and put it in his bag and stood up and said, "Thank you, Corporal. You've been very helpful." He drove back to Paris. Vauban went back to the differential on the patrol truck, which had still not been repaired, and fixed it in an hour and a half, working in the cold November yard of the gendarmerie, with his hands going red in the autumn air. He found, doing this, the thing he always found in mechanical work, the particular quality of attention it required, the way it demanded exactly what he had and nothing more. A problem with a correct answer, a solution that either worked or didn't, a thing you could hear, if you listened, before it told you what was wrong. He finished the differential. He wiped his hands on a rag. He went inside for coffee. The field above the D14 was empty through the winter, the wheat turned over, and the soil dark with the season's rain. In March, a farmer leased the land from the prefecture on favorable terms that included certain provisions he was required not to discuss publicly, and he planted it with sunflowers. And by July it was as yellow as the rest of the Var summer, and you would not have known anything had happened there. Except the sound. Occasionally, on certain still nights in September, when the weather was building from the southwest, and the harbor was flat, and the last of the tourist season was packing its windbreakers and going home, on those nights some people said they heard it. A tone. Brief. Pressing into the bone. Whether they were right about what they heard, Vauban couldn't say. He was not there on most of those nights, being home, being at the kitchen table, being with Danielle, and the Thursday wine, and the book she was or wasn't reading. But on one night in the 3rd September after the event, he was driving the D14 alone on the late shift when he heard it. He pulled the truck over. He turned off the engine. He sat for a moment, in the specific silence that follows the extinction of a car engine on a country road at night. He listened. Tone held for 8 seconds. He counted. Then it was gone, up through the cloud base without disturbing it, and the night went back to being the night. He sat in the truck for a while. Then he took out his notebook, the small one he kept in his breast pocket, the one with his mother's words in the inside cover. "I noticed," and he wrote down the time, and the duration and the frequency as best he could describe it, and the compass bearing he had estimated based on the sound's source. He did not call the general. It was past midnight, and the call could wait until morning, and he had what he needed. He started the truck and drove back to town. He knew where the water was. In the spring of the 4th year after the event, the government reclassified the incident from active to dormant. which in bureaucratic language meant, "We have decided for now to stop waiting for the next thing." This decision was reached in an office in Paris by people who had access to data Vauban would never see, and he understood this and did not resent it, because the management of large, uncertain things was its own kind of work and required a different kind, tension than the kind he had. He was still in Saint-Merou. He had been offered a transfer twice, once to a larger station with a better budget, two, a consulting role with the Paris office that handled whatever the Paris office handled. Now that it existed partly as a consequence of what had happened above the D14, he declined both. He did it politely, with the paperwork filled in correctly, in the language the forms required. He did it because Saint-Merou was his, and he was Saint-Merou's. And that was not a sentiment he could have defended analytically, but did not need to defend, because it was simply true the way some things are simply true. He was promoted to sergeant. This came with a small raise and a parking space he never used because he preferred to walk. Marchetti retired. At his party in the back room of the Café du Commerce, he gave a speech in which he referred to Vauban as his best corporal and his worst subordinate. It was true on both counts and was as close to a medal as Marchetti knew how to give. He called him Vauban for the entire party. They shook hands at the end, and Marchetti held the handshake a second longer than necessary, and Vauban understood what was in the extra second and said nothing, because there are things that language would only diminish. Berlico took the sergeant position. Taupin remained Taupin. New people came in from the academy and learned the streets slowly, the way new people always do, looking at maps first, then beginning the longer education of walking. Vauban taught the new ones what to notice. He told them about the differential on the D14. He told them about the harbor. He told them about the particular quality of attention that distinguished a gendarme who knew his town from one who merely worked in it. He did not tell them about the 11 seconds in the rain, or not directly. That story lived in the official record and in the unofficial versions. That circulated through the station over the years, with the creeping elaboration that all good stories acquire. He told them, instead, the thing his mother had told him. The most important word a policeman can speak is "I noticed." He told them to learn where the water was. He meant it literally, in the ordinary professional sense. Know your infrastructure, know your resources, know what you have available before you need it. Know the fire station's layout, and the hydrant positions, and the pressure ratings. Know the town the way you know a tool you have used for a long time. Not consciously, but completely, in the hands and the feet, and the part of the mind that works below words. But he also meant it the other way, the harder way, the way that could not be put in a training manual because it resisted formalization, the way all the important things did. He meant, know what you have, know it before the moment comes. Know the weight of the thing you carry, the town, the people, the 11 years of walking, so that when something arrives that understands everything about you, except why you care, you already have your answer. An argument, not a declaration. Just, I know where the water is. Just, I was paying attention. The wheat on the hill above the D14 stood yellow in July, and the sunflowers stood yellow in August, and in September the brown returned, and the rain came back and the Var did its autumn things. The harbor stayed a harbor, the cafe stayed a cafe. The cat stayed under the awning of the tabac, in the way that cats stay in their chosen positions, with the absolute territorial authority of creatures, have never once questioned whether the space was theirs. Vauban walked home from the late shift on a November night with the cold coming in from the sea and the bakery, starting up early, and the harbor lights doubled in the wet pavement, and he walked the streets. He had walked for 15 years now, and they were the same streets, and he was not the same person who had first walked them, but the difference was made of the streets themselves, made of the knowing of them, the attention paid to them, accumulated the way a tool acquires use, the way a hand acquires its callus. He walked home. He was the kind of man who paid attention. He knew where the water was.